the problem was I was working at a rehab, and I discovered by talking to some of the residents and by talking to some of the staff that residents were leaving, and rather than being taught to disclose in terms of their past, you know, how to be appropriate, not wear your heart on your sleeve and tell everyone your business, but, you know, when you go for a job or when you meet someone that, you know, potentially you're going to have a relationship with or whatever, you need to find a way to disclose. And but what the rehab were doing, they were helping residents, and in some cases, you know, not just helping them, but kind of saying this is the norm, this is the path that other people follow, and teaching them coming up with a cover story for maybe a gap in their CV or a break in their past. And I saw this, and I didn't agree with it, and I just, you know, I had a problem with it. And so later on, I had responsibility there, and what I started to the conversation I had with the staff and with the residents was to say, how can we teach people to disclose? Because if we don't teach them to disclose, then what we're doing is we're buying into the stigma. We're saying it's rough out there, you're not going to survive unless you can, you know, be like a bit of a spy. You know, you when it gets uncomfortable, here's your cover story. And I think that gives people low confidence in their recovery. It starts their recovery off with a lie. It means that they're not able to talk openly about, you know, the whole concept of being a broken plate. And so, yeah, we started to change that, but it's always difficult. And we compared that to, you know, the AA and the NA approach, which is also about anonymity. And I think it has its place. But the difference between that and what we've tried to do with Towards Recovery is we've tried to be visible. We've deliberately tried to be visible. And for me, that costs a bit. That visibility has a cost, you know, so you have to, when I do any kind of work to promote the cafe that strays into mainstream media, the mainstream media are less interested in my recovery, and they're more interested in a headline, you know, sort of about my crime or the amount of drugs that I used or how long I was addicted or what I did. And they want a headline, whereas I think the work of recovery is really about, you know, so me being visible is an asset, because what it does is it attracts other people that maybe want to be visible. And in America, where this, you know, the faces and voices of recovery is a big movement, they've taken it to another level, because what they're saying now in America, in fact, they've been saying it a while, is there's 23 million of us in recovery, and we pay tax and we vote. And so we want to see some legislative change, and we want to see some leveling up and that kind of stuff. So they put pressure on their local politicians and on their local bureaucrats to do stuff for them and for their families. And, you know, that leveling up, you know, as they say, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so if they can help the person in recovery and the family in recovery, then it might help other people in that society as well. And so, but none of it starts unless you're visible. And so if we buy into the stigma and the shame, then we just put our heads down and we just rely on, you know, Elton John and John Taylor and, you know, all of the celebrities to say, you know, what they need to say. Whereas most people know someone who uses drugs or has been affected by drugs, or they know someone in recovery. So I've estimated using, what's his name? The guy from Harvard who did the John Kelly. He, a lot of his work is really complicated and I don't understand it. It's research work, but I found a statistic that he came up with, and it was something like in America, 9% of the adult population would either identify as in recovery or would say they had a problem relationship with drugs and alcohol, which they no longer have. If you look at 9% of the adult population in the UK, I think it comes to 4 million. When you look at the treatment population in England and Wales, it's something like 330,000 people with what they would call problem drug users, and that includes alcohol. And when you look at the numbers who, the prevalence estimate, it probably comes to about 1 million people in addiction. But there's 4 million in recovery. And so part of me wants to say, if we could harness the 4 million, then we would have a voice, and we would be able to say, not that I'm political, it's the last place I want to be, but there's 4 million people in recovery. If they were visible, they would have an impact. Just like the story I told you a while ago about the one guy who sat among people in recovery in our cafe, and then at the end of the night said, how do I get what they've got? That conversation I had with him, what I didn't tell you before, is that led to our first conference, because he went off and changed his life. But I sat there afterwards and thought, well, if 5 or 6 people can have an effect on one person just by, sitting among them, what would it be like if we had 100 people in recovery in Henley and we had a conference? It might be able to affect the whole town, So in my mind, I took something from that conversation as well. And that led to our first conference in 2013. And we got about 100, 120 people in an audience, and we had some really great speakers to talk about recovery and addiction, and people at different ends of the scale, so we could have a good argument and discussion over lunch afterwards. And yeah, if we weren't willing to be visible, that would have been a kind of clandestine conference that we didn't advertise and we didn't talk about in any way. But instead, because we were willing to be visible, we brought this amazing thing to our little town. I don't know if it had a lasting impact, but for that moment, it changed the atmosphere, and people were willing to stand up and say, I'm in recovery. In fact, I think we had at the beginning, we had people willing, and I was certainly one of them, to hold up a plaque. And
I remember that.
Both sides of the plaque had, I used to be a drug user and now I'm in recovery, or something. It was personal to that person, to those people. And it certainly gave people in recovery confidence that they were part of a community of people in recovery, not standing alone like a Tottenham supporter in the Liverpool Cop End. It was a real moment where we thought, actually, we're connected in some way. We're part of a bigger community. And I used to see it as, in my mind's eye, I used to see it as a kind of barren land with bits of kind of little oases here and there. And though, if the more people who are willing to find one of those oases and stand in it, the more the greenery grows. And suddenly, they all start, recovery communities start to connect to each other.